Morning, it's 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, which I thank you for. It's an odd one, isn't it? You know when, and my apologies if you're not in the parenting business, because this analogy depends or presumes that you are, but it won't alienate you. It's very, very easy to understand. You know when your mum comes to visit and you haven't seen her for a while, lockdown being a fairly good recent example of when a much longer gap than usual may have been imposed upon interfamilial interactions. And your mum comes to visit, she goes, "Oh, crikey, haven't they grown? Haven't the kids grown? Oh, haven't they grown?" she says. And you think, well, no, they're exactly the same size as they were yesterday. And you're both right, because they have grown, obviously, what with being mammals, young mammals, and they are probably, more or less, give or take a sort of micrometre or three, exactly the same size as they were yesterday. But because she hasn't seen them for a while, the growth is a lot more striking. And because we've been with them every day, they look, well, the same as they did yesterday, and you don't notice that they're bigger than they were last year because you've been with them every day in the last year. That's your sort of growth equivalent of the boiling a frog analogy, the idea that if you put a frog in water, I'm told this isn't true, and please don't try it at home, if you put a frog in cold water and put the heat on and the water heats up slowly, the frog won't notice that it's boiling. We'll never reach a point where the frog goes, aye, it's getting a bit hot around here, I'm going to hop out, because it increases incrementally and sort of lulls the frog into a false sense of security, and the next thing you know, it's cooked. As I say, please don't try that at home. But the point I'm making is that sometimes when it's happening all around you, you don't notice. When it's happening more and more, you don't notice. If it arrives like a juggernaut smashing through your sitting room wall, you are going to be aware of it. But if it's termites slowly nibbling away at your living room wall, you don't really notice that you are approaching the point where the wall is perhaps going to fall down. And that is, some days, that's how I feel about the vote Leave government. And I call them that for a very specific and limited reason. It's because that, for me, and you may choose a different starting point, that was the point where something broke with regard to public discourse. So Boris Johnson yesterday was forced to defend our country, this sceptred isle, from accusations of being corrupt. I don't think that would have happened 2.5 years ago. We could have faced accusations of all sorts of things, and some of them would have been unfair and some of them would have been fair. But the idea that the United Kingdom is corrupt, and I know you're not, and I know I'm not, and I know we bridle slightly at being sort of lumped in with what the government appears to be trying to do to Parliament and other institutions, but unfortunately a fish rots from the head down. So if there is corruption at the top, then the claim that the country is corrupt becomes compelling. I want today to examine what we think corruption is, and whether or not the conduct of the current administration fits our descriptions. The number you will need is 0345 6060 973. I'm going to play you, and just focus on this. He hasn't been Prime Minister. Well, he has, of course. He's been Prime Minister for more than 2 years, forgive me, but he hasn't won an election. It's not 2 years since he won an election. Not 2 years since he won a general election. Imagine if this was another country. Not the brilliant Julian Mitchell play turned into a superlative film starring Rupert Everett and Colin Firth. But imagine if this was another country, a country other than ours. Imagine if it was someone that historically you've been primed not to like. So pretty much anybody foreign, really, if you look at most of the right-wing media. Imagine if Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron were in this situation. Never mind a sort of a Saddam Hussein or a Colonel Gaddafi. That you've got this catalogue of criticism, this catalogue of evidence, and they're forced to stand up and claim, we're not corrupt. So I don't know where you would start. You know, I think where I would start. The most egregious one for me is the dispatching of Jacob Rees-Mogg to Balmoral to mislead Her Majesty the Queen, and then to unlawfully prorogue Parliament, the thing about which they had... unlawfully, I beg your pardon, the thing about which they had misled the Queen. So, I mean... You mislead the head of state and then you unlawfully prorogue Parliament. You see what I mean now about the frog boiling or the kids growing? Because you should really then have been, oh my God, there's a juggernaut just come through our sitting room, but we didn't, and we don't, and we continue not to. Some people prefer sunlit uplands, which we are now, of course, in. technically. We are in the sunlit uplands that were promised by Boris Johnson when we left the single market and the customs union. We're nearly a year into the sunlit uplands. I don't know how sunlit it's looking where you are, but that was a promise that the man who is currently in charge made. We had a world-beating test and trace system, you'll remember, presided over by a woman called Dido Harding, who is married to a man called Penrose. I think it's Simon or John. I should have this stuff. He's definitely called Penrose. She's married to a man called Penrose, who is the Cabinet Office's anti-corruption champion. I mean, great that they've got one, right? They've got an anti-corruption champion. That's fantastic. And he was interviewed a couple of days ago, and he was asked about that Sunday Times story, that huge Sunday Times story that dominated news agendas, and the one about 15 out of the last 16 Tory treasurers giving £3 million to the party and ending up in the House of Lords. He was asked about that, and he claimed he hadn't seen it. So he's the anti-corruption champion who's married to Dido Harding, who presided over the world-beating test and trace system that cost £37 billion and was, by most measures, an almighty, humongous waste of money. 9 minutes after 10 is the time. They threw a protective ring around care homes, they said. Well, tens of thousands of people died unnecessarily in precisely those care homes. And we nodded that through as well. The Barnard Castle eye test. Huge moment in the corruption, I would argue, of a country when the most senior members of government and many of their cheerleaders in the media were queuing up to pretend, I presume to pretend, that they believed an absolute farrago of Dominic Cummings-flavoured nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Last week, Owen Paterson's innocence. In the context of all the stuff that we're discussing, innocence in inverted quotes, of course, it's a relatively small pebble in the shoe of our democracy, isn't it? I mean, the reason it landed so hard, I believe, got to stop using the royal we, I'm pompous enough already. The reason it landed so hard, I think, is because it couldn't be excused in the way that the proroguing of Parliament, the sunlit uplands, even the world-beating test and trace, the protective ring, you couldn't file it all under either getting Brexit done or there's a pandemic on, folks, everybody chill. The Patterson story couldn't be filed under that, so that landed. Priti Patel being a bully, the actual Home Secretary being found to be a bully by an independent inquiry. Just sweep that one under the carpet. Absolutely nothing to see here. Everybody move along. And then back to the 350 million quid for the NHS. The claim, the promise being that we would have more money. We would have £350 million a week more money as a result of leaving a market that has left us, by every available measure, considerably worse off. So, is this country corrupt? 0345 6060 973. And all of that, apart from the Patterson bit, is without mentioning the stuff that's gone on in the last week. This Owen Patterson story acting as a sort of almost an uncorking, if you like, of corruption and cronyism allegations. You'll remember from yesterday that Ian Duncan-Smith is apparently such an expert on hand sanitizer that a company is paying him 25 grand a year for his expertise and insights. And by a matter of complete coincidence, the Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform, which he chairs for the government, made recommendations recently that were to the benefit of the hand sanitizer company that pays him 25 grand a year. We've got another one being paid £250,000 to advise an international mining company while serving as Boris Johnson's trade envoy to a country that has large deposits of gold, copper and coal. This is Daniel Kawczynski, the Conservative MP for Shrewsbury and Atcham and the UK's trade envoy to Mongolia. He's also about 6'10", which suggests to me, as we mentioned yesterday, he's probably not been down many mines. And these are like tips of multiple icebergs. I went through yesterday, I had all my little stories cut out of the newspaper and I was running through them all, but I don't want to do that today. I think giving you the context from going right back to the 350 million quid bus, which is where it all begins, of course. Of course it does. Of course it does. Just unravels in this most peculiar way. 10:13 is the time. Here's Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, less than 2 years after winning a general election, being essentially forced on a stage which he could have been using to provide clarity and leadership for the entire world on planet-saving environmental measures, being forced to refute allegations that he is now presiding over a corrupt country.
Since we're in an international context and speaking before international colleagues, I want to say one thing which I hope is not taken in any chauvinistic spirit, but I genuinely believe that the UK is not remotely a corrupt country, nor do I believe that our institutions are corrupt, and I think it's very, very important to say that. We have a very, very tough system of parliamentary democracy and scrutiny, and not least by the media. I just want to say the most important thing is those who break the rules must be investigated and should be punished. And on second jobs, I would say that for hundreds of years, MPs have gone to Parliament and also done work as doctors or lawyers or soldiers or firefighters or writers or all sorts of other trades and callings. And on the whole, the world of the UK population has understood that has actually strengthened our democracy, because people basically feel that parliamentarians do need to have some experience of the world. But if that system is going to continue today, then it is crucial that MPs follow the rules.
Priti Patel, of course, broke the rules, such as they are, or at least was found to by the independent advisor on standards, who reported back to the Prime Minister, who ignored the report, prompting the then independent advisor on standards to resign. So, you know, he does not have a fruitful and fertile relationship with the truth. I think at this point in the past I would have reminded you of his relations with both wives, ex-wives and mistresses and former employers, party leaders, colleagues, all of that. But I don't think I need to anymore. I think finally that the cheerleaders have put down their pom-poms, perhaps temporarily, and are finally beginning to tell you at least a scintilla of truth about what this particular politician has always represented. But the point today is about the country, not the leader. What defines a corrupt country? As you mentioned institutions there. There's this chap called Sir Robbie Gibb, who was an advisor. He used to work at the BBC. He is was an advisor to Theresa May. He's been parachuted into the BBC, I think, as a non-executive director. And his brother-in-law has now been appointed to the board that will look for the new head of Ofcom, which turned down the former editor of the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre, as unsuitable the first time round. But they've ripped up the rule book, rejigged the rigmarole, and appointed Robbie Gibb's brother-in-law to the panel that will now appoint a new head of Ofcom. Yeah. There's also another Conservative Party donor who's on the body that appoints board members to the BBC, but she only gave 50 grand, so she doesn't yet get a seat in the House of Lords. Yeah. And Geoffrey Cox earned more than £6 million from his second job while ostensibly representing the people of West Devon. So what is corruption? 0345 6060 973. What does it look like? What definition do you work from? And does that cap fit this country? I would like to think we could separate the head from the rest of the fish, because I know you're not corrupt and I know I'm not corrupt. But I don't know if you can when you're looking at an unlawful proroguing of Parliament, for example, a deliberate or profoundly ignorant mission to mislead the Queen by the man who is still the leader of the House of Commons. A media that has cheer-led for much of this madness right up until the middle of last week, and now apparently is having a fit of the vapours and clutching its pearls in some corners. Some newspapers still getting their knickers in a twist about Meghan Markle, because that's huge, isn't it, when your country's facing accusations of corruption on the world stage. Let's all go after the Duchess of Sussex again. But most of the media recognising now that something really rotten seems to be unfolding. If you want to refute this analysis, then the phone line is even more open for you than it is for everybody else. Seriously, because if you sound even vaguely sensible in your attempt to describe what is currently going on and all the things I've just listed as nothing to worry about, then part of me really wants you to be right. Let's get the phone lines open. What is corruption? And is the UK, at the moment, looking like a country that could be objectively described as corrupt? And having said that, I wonder if outsiders will have a particularly interesting perspective. Outsiders living here or not. This catalogue of events that I've described to you, unfolding, very much a work in progress, new stuff on the horizon. Is that what corruption looks like? 0345 6060 973. 22 minutes after 10, so I think it's probably worth mentioning that John Major, who of course was Prime Minister last time the Conservative Party was engulfed in accusations of sleaze, albeit a Prime Minister who did his best to clean up, and Martin Bell, the man in the white suit who fought Neil Hamilton and won in Tatton. Neil Hamilton, in many ways, the embodiment of that era of Tory sleaze. They have both gone on the record in the last few days to say what's happening now is much worse. And that perhaps is why the C word has crept into proceedings, because what's worse than sleaze? Corruption. I'm going to play a slightly shorter version of what Boris Johnson said yesterday, because I really think it's important. This is one of those mornings where I am pointing at him, screaming at you that he is naked.
Since we're in an international context and speaking before international colleagues, I want to say one thing which I hope is not taken in any chauvinistic spirit, but I genuinely believe that the UK is not remotely a corrupt country, nor do I believe that our institutions are corrupt. And I think it's very, very important to say that. We have a very, very tough system of parliamentary democracy and scrutiny, and not least by the media.
Just pause, because that was delivered 1 week to the day after he whipped his MPs to vote to ignore a report into the egregious conduct of a Member of Parliament, a member of his own party, and indeed to rip up the whole rule book on anti-corruption. So there's something really gross going on there. A week after he tried to ride roughshod over parliamentary scrutiny, he's defending himself from accusations of corruption by citing the strength and efficacy of parliamentary scrutiny. As for the media, well, I'll leave you to look at my Twitter feed to avail yourselves of the attitude that some current members of his cabinet take towards journalism and a free press. 24 minutes after 10 is the time. And finally, that Ofcom story in full. A former Tory advisor married to a Tory MP and the brother-in-law of a former Tory communications chief installed on a panel to interview the Tory candidate Paul Dacre for Ofcom after an independent panel showed him the door, having explained why he was entirely unsuitable for that role. John's in Buckhurst Hill. What's corruption? What does it look like? And have we got it here, John?
Good morning, James. Yes, big fan.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course we're corrupt, but we're only corrupt from the top upwards. It's at the very top is extremely corrupt. My father, God bless him, an Italian immigrant, used to say countries like Italy were corrupt all the way through. You could bribe the dustbin man, you could bribe the doctor.
Yes.
My uncle got his driving licence without ever driving a car.
Yes.
So the corruption, it was not exclusive to... It was, in general, everybody. Here, in this country, the top end are corrupt, and they are extremely corrupt, and they keep the corruption to themselves.
Well, I think you mean cronyism, historically, or the old school tie, rather than actual corruption. For me, corruption is, for example, sacking independent... or forcing the resignation of independent advisers on standards after they've found one of your own to be guilty. Corruption is forcing MPs to vote for the abolition of anti-corruption rules and to exonerate somebody. So that, I think your late father was describing more jobs for the boys than he was actually describing corruption, or not? Am I misrepresenting him?
I tend to disagree. I think there is a huge element of corruption, because it's kept to the very top.
But what is it? Give me your definition of corruption, because I genuinely don't think, and I was no cheerleader for her, but there's no earthly way Theresa May would have sent the Leader of the House of Commons to the Queen to mislead her and then unlawfully prorogue Parliament. That just would not have happened under any Prime Minister in our lifetimes.
Well, maybe not Theresa May, but the clown that's running us at the moment has used various methods, and it's not financial corruption.
No.
Sometimes it can be corruption via this House of Lords business.
Well, £3 million to get a seat in the House of Lords actually probably is either a coincidence, of course, as one of them claimed. I can't remember, I get them all mixed up now. Or corruption, in the sense that I think you and I understand the word to mean things that are for sale that should not be for sale. There's one definition, perhaps.
Possibly. but I do believe that it's kept to the very top.
Well, I like that analysis in a way. I mean, there'll be plenty of people ringing in pointing out that backhanders for councillors here and stories about corruption at a council level there, or companies that have, built someone an extension mysteriously shortly after the award of a lucrative contract. I don't want to use the word naive. I think it is more, the sort of corruption you're talking about is probably more widespread. But the essence of political corruption involves more, I think, looking at other countries. Italy would be a very good example. Berlusconi, in many ways, should have been a shot across the bows of liberal democracies. Instead, Berlusconi, in some ways, acted as a bit of an aperitif for the likes of Donald Trump and possibly for the likes of Boris Johnson. So give me proof that he is not corrupt, if you can. 0345 60 60 973. I can't believe Boris Johnson has James talking about the corruption of the country rather than his Tory party and establishment. That's a heartbreakingly silly analysis. I mean, the fact that I now have to say to you, Boris Johnson is in charge of the whole country suggests, well, maybe you didn't think things through. This account is called Views from the Left. Maybe you didn't think things through before you sent that in. The man is in charge of the entire country. Parliament voted last week to rip up anti-corruption regulations. The notion that you can somehow separate the driver from the car, well, that is actually naive rather than silly. So I'll withdraw the accusation of silliness. Mokhtar is in Westminster. Mokhtar, what's going on?
Hi. Thank you, James, for taking the call. I think, for me, the country is definitely corrupt. Or heading towards corruption,
yes.
Not to make the exaggerated claim.
No, maybe there's time to slam the brakes on it. Well, that would be quite a good analysis, I think.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, for me, the image of corruption is the lack of guardrails, accountability, and consequences. It's not an act in and of itself. If institutions lack the ability to punish, to self-correct, just exactly like you're talking, removing these laws, removing these consequences from the system.
Leaving people in post after they've been found to have offended. I mean, that's almost the definition of
exactly
what we're talking
about. Exactly. The problem is, and I think that it's because things start small, people feel like they can let it slide. And then it starts with something very small. This is a hand sanitizer company. It's okay because we're in a pandemic. This is the proroguing of Parliament, as you said, is okay because of Brexit. You justify these things, but ultimately you will be at the other end at some point in time. And these things become bigger. And it's how these systems become. I think a lot of people here, as I was telling you, I'm Egyptian, yes. A lot of people here take many of these things for granted. And as someone who came from a country where there is no accountability, where there is no democracy, this is how you end up with a system that is completely not accountable to its population.
And you mentioned your Egyptian status as a sort of parallel between things you've seen unfold in your own country.
Exactly, 100%.
I saw a citizen of the former Yugoslavia actually making similar points on Twitter this weekend. What does the break look like? I'm late for the news, so I've asked you to solve all the problems in the world in 30 seconds, if you could, Mokhtar. That would be very much appreciated.
I think the break looks like, to be honest, is that there has to be a change in leadership in the Tory party from within the Tory party. Why? Because it sends the signal that even your own people will not stand to this, that the system is more important than the person.
And if they're doing it more through a form of electoral self-preservation than a sudden discovery of conscience or moral compass, then we just have to be grateful for small mercies and take what we can get. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I'm paraphrasing Mokhtar because I am already late for the very latest news headlines with Thomas Watts. 10:36 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where you can take your pick. I've got a bit of an analysis myself now, having spoken to Mokhtar, a chap who grew up in Egypt, and drawing very telling parallels between what you would call corruption in that country and the growing sense of corruption in this country. I think because you have rules and standards, right? A society without rules or standards is not actually a society. It's anarchic, I guess. So you have rules and standards. Corruption. A country becomes corrupt when the ruling class or the elites or whatever you want to call them don't abide by the rules and standards. Now, there's always going to be an element of that, isn't there? It's essentially what privilege is. I used to have a very genuine theory that the very top of society and the very bottom of society are more or less morally identical. The way that aristocrats behave would be mirrored in the behaviour of the kind of families depicted in the comedy drama Shameless. It's everybody in between who abides by rules and standards. But when the people in charge of the rules and standards don't believe that the rules and standards apply to them, that to me is pretty close to the definition of a corrupt country. And I'd love to hear you attempt to explain how that description doesn't fit this government like a glove, particularly after last week's events. You know, the rules that apply to you if you're found to be a bully in the workplace don't apply to Priti Patel because Boris Johnson doesn't want them to. The rules that apply to all MPs didn't last week apply to Owen Paterson because Boris Johnson didn't want them to. The standards by which they are all expected to abide, Boris Johnson doesn't think should apply to him. Simple things that we teach our children, like telling the truth, shouldn't apply to Jacob Rees-Mogg in his dealings with Her Majesty the Queen because Boris Johnson didn't want them to. Lawfulness shouldn't apply to Boris Johnson's government when it comes to something as piffling and trivial as proroguing our actual parliament, because Boris Johnson doesn't want them to. So that letter from his teacher at Eton that described in terms his utter contempt for the idea that he should have to abide by the same rules as everybody else, I would argue that is now the governing ideology of his government. I really would. I'll find you the letter. 10:38 is the time. Richard's in Woolwich. Richard, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating topic.
It's not exactly uplifting, though, is it?
Well, hey, I've got COVID right now, so
I'm sorry to hear that.
No, that's okay. It's I've had my vaccine, so I'm feeling great. So,
yes.
But what my angle on this is that I feel it's a I feel we're living in a bankrupt society at the moment. It just feels bankrupted. It feels morally, socially, politically bankrupt. Is it corrupt? Yeah, I think aspects of it are corrupt completely. And the thing that I keep coming back to is this, what you just mentioned actually is what I was thinking about last night, that Britain is a self-preserving system. It always has been. And I think Brexit was the trigger. For me, Brexit was always a moment of trying to get back that self-preservation that it lost over, I think probably a couple of 100 years.
Yes.
And for me now, that started with deceit. For me, I'm being contentious, but I believe Brexit needed to start with moments of lying and deceit. And since that moment, there has been non-stop deceit upon deceit, which I think is fueling a much more
and of course,
corruption.
A huge number of people who supported the idea of Brexit have absolutely nothing to do with what you describe, and equally won't recognise or agree with what you describe. Some of them, I think, have woken up to the fact that they were sold a whole load of lies or a whole load of things that were never capable of coming true. But equally, we all find it very hard to climb down from those sort of positions. But the fact that the liars then got promoted, the fact that they went on to take over the whole of government, Theresa May trying to walk that tightrope while knowing that it was a very bad idea, but also believing in her heart that she absolutely had to deliver something that fitted the description of Brexit. She got shaken off the tightrope by Boris Johnson, who then started dancing around as if he'd already walked across it when he was still stuck on the other side. And that weaponisation, that proliferation of deceit and dishonesty, I don't know, actually, Richard. Do you think it could have stopped there? I mean, maybe they could have, because I wondered about this. Maybe they'll just take that win. But the problem is that all of the other stuff, in a sense, leads back to Brexit because they have to be a little bit dishonest. They have to call the test and trace world beating because they have to create the implicit idea that we're better than the rest of the world. So that weird exceptionalism crept in, and that exceptionalism, in a way, is a definition of a worldview that says the rules shouldn't have to apply to us. They shouldn't have to apply to me, which we're seeing in Northern Ireland. You know, we've signed an international treaty, but we can't be expected to abide by the terms of what we negotiated and agreed. When you think about it, it reaches into almost every corner of this administration.
Yes, it does. And one of the corners it reaches in, which I find fascinating, is how people who rail against the system end up becoming assimilated into the system. There's only two ways to go in a system. You either get rejected by the system or you become assimilated by it. And I find fascinating, even the Brexiteers that went into the Reform Party and started talking about, you know, reforming the system, they are now in the House of Lords. And these people actually were the ones that stood on a platform to say that they didn't want unelected bureaucrats, and they are now, there's a handful of them that are now in the House of Lords, unelected bureaucrats ruling us and making rules. They have become part of the self-preservation.
Well, because they get rewarded, I guess. I mean, it is probably that simple. And who knows what your price would be? Who knows what principles you might abandon in return for a big bauble and a very, very cosy lifetime sinecure in the House of Lords. I'm not suggesting you would be up for sale in that way. I hope I wouldn't be. But you don't know until someone offers it to you whether or not you'd take it as well, although some of the people that did were, I grant you, particularly egregious examples of hypocrisy. Claire Fox, I think, being perhaps the most egregious of all. 10:43 is the time. Here's that line in that letter. I think he honestly believes that it is churlish of us not to regard him as an exception, one who should be free of the network of obligation which binds everyone else. That's a letter from the Master in College at Eton to Boris Johnson's father from the 10th of April 1982. Now, you know, the child is the father of the man, but some of us are lucky enough to grow and to change and to recognise what we want to improve about ourselves as time passes. Some of us think we're perfectly wonderful already, thank you very much, and there's absolutely nothing to change at all. So you can't hold him to that like a millstone around his neck. But if we're working on the definition of corruption as a belief, whether conscious or unconscious, that the rules are for the little people. There was a hotelier in America who got done for epic tax evasion. I mean, millions and millions of dollars. I think her name was Leonora Helmsley. And she was reported to have said taxes are for the little people. And I think a definition of corruption would be that, yes, our society has rules and standards, but they are for the little people. And if you wanted to take that down to an individual level, this phrase here, I think he honestly believes that it is churlish of us not to regard him as an exception, one who should be free of the network of obligation which binds everyone else. And of course, in order to sustain the belief that he should be free of the network of obligation which binds everyone else, he has to extend that freedom to his allies. He has to extend that freedom to Priti Patel when she's found to be a bully, to Owen Paterson when he's found to have acted corruptly, to Jacob Rees-Mogg when he's found to have misled the Queen about the unlawful proroguing of Parliament, to all of his allies. Ultimately, the freedom from the network of obligation which binds everyone else becomes the tent under which his leadership can survive. You remember the lockdown rules under which you were not allowed to drive to Barnard Castle and back under pretty much any circumstances at all. But Dominic Cummings was, because he should be free of the network of obligation which binds everyone else. And when things get really sticky and very hard to justify, you can just lie about it and claim, for example, that you were testing your eyesight. And in this country, until last week, you could phone up a dozen journalists at the drop of a hat on Fleet Street, or indeed in broadcasting, and get them to punt this nonsense on your behalf in return for, dinner at their club. Your definitions of corruption and your answer to the question of whether or not it fits the UK at the moment. More to follow. 50 is the time, so maybe a little bit of the prediction now, in the terms of what the play appears to be, and Ian Dunt has pointed this out. I'm certainly not claiming the credit for it myself. But the line is now, oh, well, yes, but constituents can decide how they feel about this sort of thing. It's not for us to decide. So it's this sort of complete abnegation of responsibility coupled with a belief that the standards and rules that the rest of us live by shouldn't apply to them. But you see it with face masks and the front bench of the House of Commons. You see it essentially embodied in Jacob Rees-Mogg. But this strange abnegation of responsibility now will become, yes, this isn't great, but it's up to constituents to decide. Now, there are two major problems with that. Actually, there's one massive problem with that, and that is that constituents rely upon the media to tell them the truth about politicians. I don't think I need to go any further, do I? I mean, just pick a favourite cheerleader for Boris Johnson and or Brexit, because you can't separate the two, and then tell me how confident you are that they're going to tell you the truth about what's going on in this country at the moment. They're going to be, for example, as outraged as you are by the knowledge that the government's own anti-corruption champion claimed he hadn't read the piece about 15 out of 16 of the last Tory treasurers getting a seat in the House of Lords after giving £3 million to the Tory party. That's Banana Republic stuff, right? But he hadn't seen the piece. I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware of that. I'll find you the clip, actually. You deserve to hear it for yourself. And then you're reeling from that revelation. You're really... He's what? He's supposed to be the anti-corruption czar. What's his job if he's not aware of a story in one of the best-selling newspapers in the country detailing £3 million donations apparently being rewarded with seats in the House of Lords? He calls himself the anti-corruption champion. That's his job. So you're reeling from that revelation. You're getting cross about that. And then I tell you, he's married to Dido Harding. Corruption and cronyism, like horse and carriage. Love and marriage. 10:52 is the time. Sal's in Manchester. Sal, what do you reckon?
Hi, James. First time caller.
Welcome.
I'm basically an immigrant. I moved to UK in 2016. I'm originally from Pakistan.
Okay.
Now, as far as the Owen Pattinson and the Jeffrey Cox examples are concerned, these are perfect examples of corruption. There is no doubt about that.
Well, Jeffrey Cox hasn't actually broken any rules.
Yes, but he's he's using his... now, the problem is, obviously, if you use your public office or, if there's any hint that you've used your public funded resources to do something else... Then
he may have broken that one, but it's not on the same scale as Owen Pattinson. I prefer this phrase here, Sal, this phrase from Martin Hammond, the master in college at Eton, talking about Boris Johnson in 1982. He believes he should be free of the network of obligation which binds everyone else. That's almost a definition of society, a network of obligation which binds everyone else. And under that network of obligation which binds everyone else in, for example, Parliament, you probably shouldn't be trousering £400,000 for working in the British Virgin Islands while your constituents are enduring a particularly tricky lockdown. So it's not... it may be corruption, but it's not criminal or law-breaking or rule-breaking.
But, in terms of classifying whether an act is corruption, obviously there are different levels to corruption.
There's also libel laws.
So there are many levels to corruption, and obviously the reason I said I'm from Pakistan and I moved to UK in 2016 because there's a lot of history attached to this word corruption for me personally.
Yes.
If you've got a prime minister, in my country, obviously everyone knows the infamous Nawaz Sharif, who's actually hiding in London at the moment. He's one of the richest people in Pakistan, and he was the prime minister for many years. And that is your proper, full-blown, textbook corruption.
Well, and we don't have anything comparable to that happening in this country.
So it's all relative. Obviously, the fact that we're talking about this and highlighting and obviously...
When you arrived here in 2016, how would you have seen the United Kingdom in the context of corruption, compared perhaps to your native Pakistan? Would you have seen us as a sort of shining beacon of probity and almost as the opposite of Pakistan, or not?
I think, and there obviously, and there's few things that you could obviously definitely say that this country is obviously doing a lot better, in so many different ways. So number one is the rule of law is quite strict. For example, if I am not a British citizen and if I get points on my license. You know, it's just talking about, you know, running a red light or overspeeding.
Yeah.
There is a very, very good chance I will not get citizenship just because I broke some traffic rules. So the rule of law is very strict. The fact that a police officer doesn't have to carry a gun in this country means that, you know, the rule of law is pretty strict. You know, I can't, you know...
But then we have the government, Boris Johnson unlawfully prorogued Parliament. I mean, it's not necessarily a rule of law issue, but laws are the ultimate rules, aren't they? Or the ultimate obligations, the ultimate network of obligations.
And they are enforced. So that means that, you know, if it was a corrupt nation, then you'd get away with a murder. Because that the judiciary and the bureaucracy is not that bad, and that these rules are being implemented in a transparent manner, and people can go to the courts and they can raise issues through the ministers if they're not happy about how things are, and you know, ministers are being asked to step down, means that we're not, in terms of corruption, to be classed as a corrupt country. Fortunately, we're not there yet.
No, I think partly because we can still see the wood for the trees, as it were. We can still call this stuff out. I'm still allowed to say it on national radio. We can still recognise it when we're given the tools that we need to recognise it. In the context of ridiculous text, I'll read this one out today from... thank you, Sal. That was lovely. This is from Hardev. He goes, I hope, James, you will take a few minutes out from your constant rant against the government. It's just a list of facts, mate, but I can see how it won't land happily in some ears, and mention that the infection rate in Germany yesterday was 50,000 plus. Hardev, do send me another text. Why? Why do you want me to mention that? I usually get around to the comparison of infection rates at some point in the programme. Germany's having an absolute mare at the moment, but why do you want me to mention that? Because it sounds really, really weird. This government is awful, but lots of people in Germany are getting ill, so nah. Forgive me if I've misunderstood the thrust of your point. I know we were up yesterday to back near 40,000. I'll do the thing in the hope that you will then pay me the compliment of responding to tell me why you think that's important, because I'm increasingly drawn to looking at the texts that seem to me to be absolutely crackers and trying to actually get to the bottom of them. I think people like you possibly don't ring me anymore, whereas once you would have done, because... I suppose going viral isn't much fun in those sort of contexts, as the poor fella discovered earlier this week when he was trying to defend the behaviour of Conservative MPs. So stay there, because we've got something important to do in a minute, and I'll just get you those numbers, Hardev, and I'll read them out in full. I always use the Times' numbers, and then you can text me back and tell me why you think that we should somehow leaven out an evidence-based critique of our current government and the accusation of corruption with the news of COVID infection rates from Germany. So in the most new cases, according to the table that I always use on this programme, which comes from this morning's Times newspaper, 79,820 in the US, 41,286 in Germany, 39,329 in the UK, 37,999 in Russia. But so there you are. I've done what you asked. Perhaps you now could do what I ask and tell me why you think that a critique of the British government that is based entirely on evidence, facts and history, because I get a lot of texts like this, and I'd love to know what's going on in your mind. It can somehow be balanced out by the news that Germany in the last 24 hours had about 1,000 or so more COVID infection rates than we do. And that's it for now on this subject, because... well, you know what the date is, and you probably know what the time is. And that means that in a moment, LBC will join the nation in pausing for 2 minutes to mark the moment that the guns fell silent along the Western Front in the First World War, exactly 103 years ago. We'll also be remembering all those who have died for their country in battle since that day. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, we will remember them. At 4 minutes after 11 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mean, it's talking about corruption. Front page of the Times today. Hundreds of companies set up after the government's furlough scheme was established claimed up to £26.6 million from the taxpayer. So, quite how you could have furloughed after setting up after the pandemic started is something that HM's Revenue and Customs will be looking into. They've been ordered to recover £1 billion in fraudulent or mistaken claims. So, you know, the notion that there's always dodgy stuff going on, otherwise we wouldn't have people in prisons, we wouldn't have courts, we wouldn't have rules, regulations, laws. But this notion, and I'm going to stay with this because, well, for two reasons. You'll allow me a little moment of patting myself on the back. We tend to move a little earlier than most members of the media on this sort of stuff, and we tend to be right. So I'm staying with it. I'm drawn to it by the fact that Boris Johnson felt the need to tell the world that this country isn't corrupt. Boris Johnson, who, when one of his closest supporters was asked if he'd ever done anything in his life that could be construed as upholding standards or promoting standards in public life, I think it was Kwasi Kwarteng who responded, well, he got Brexit done. Which is surreal. It is a truly surreal moment, but it's no more surreal than all the other moments that are clocking up on the moment rank at the moment. My favourite today, and it changes every minute almost, but today I think my favourite is probably the fact that the anti-corruption czar in this country is married to Dido Harding, who presided over £37 billion worth of test and trace. He's the anti-corruption czar. Oh, and he didn't know about that story in the Sunday Times. Incredible. And then this letter, I think he honestly believes. See, when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. That lovely line from Maya Angelou, which I don't fully agree with, because I think that we are shaped by our experiences, and the negative experiences that shape us can be shaved off and even undone. You know, it's why I am, if you are interested in such matters, I'm a huge, huge fan of therapy. I think therapy is the way that you undo harm done to you that led you to do harm to yourself and possibly to others. It's why I personally believe that boarding schools, certainly the older model of boarding schools, I don't necessarily want you to beat yourself up if you send your children to them at the moment, but the older model of particularly all-male boarding schools, the biggies, I think have done untold damage to those of us that went through them, but we come out of them quite often thinking that the damage is a benefit. You know, the old stiff upper lip line, it didn't do us any harm line. And that is why I think that the letter from Boris Johnson's teacher to Boris Johnson's father about Boris Johnson in 1982 is incredibly relevant, because he strikes me as a man who has never felt the need to change course or correct his worldview or examine himself or indeed try to be a better man. I could be wrong, but there it is. I think he honestly believes that it is churlish of us not to regard him as an exception, one who should be free of the network of obligation which binds everyone else. I mean, can you honestly challenge that as his attitude? Could you honestly argue that he's changed? Oh, no, he's a huge fan of the network of obligation which binds everyone else. I mean, Boris Johnson is a byword for living by the rules and standards that govern society. I don't even think that's funny anymore. And, of course, the problem with cults, and I use the word advisedly, is that the followers are not just ambivalent about the flaws and the failings of the leader, they almost revel in them. So you probably could find, I'm not going to mention any names, but next time PMQs is on, have a look at how some members of the front bench look at him. Have a look at how some members of the cabinet just look at Boris Johnson, okay? They're literally, physical, clock how they look at him, because they think that it is churlish of us not to regard him as an exception as well. It's not just that he thinks it. And then, of course, you've got the doff-cap tug-forelock brigade up and down the country, which also think good old Boris shouldn't have to live by the rules that the rest of us live by. You saw it in olden times with monarchs, you know. The idea that Henry VIII could have 6 wives at a time of, you know, relative puritanical outlooks on life for the lower orders. 6 wives? The man was clearly a syphilitic psychopath, and we still treat him like some sort of national hero in this country. So the the way a cult works, a leadership cult works, is that you don't just excuse the failures and foibles of your leader. You positively celebrate them. You revel in them. While also, and this is the bit I don't think I'll ever get, while also being authoritarian. You look at Trump. Look at Trump's moral history. The man's depraved, utterly and completely depraved. And the bits that you could perhaps respond to or refute or argue with, you could say, well, you can't call him a sex offender just because he boasted about being a sex offender. There's no proof that he actually was a sex offender. Or you can come out like one of his little house elves and claim, well, it's just locker room talk. All men talk like that in private. I can tell you categorically that they don't. But the affair with the pornographic actress that he embarked upon shortly after his last child was born, that's a matter of record, not a matter of opinion. And yet a lot of his supporters see themselves as evangelical Christians. They see themselves as moral. So they don't just, once a cult takes hold like this, that's the weird bit, isn't it? Because if you've never been in one, you don't really know what it's like. You don't only give a free pass to the misbehaviour of your leader. You almost celebrate. You say, yeah, that's why we love him so much, because he's an adulterous liar. Talking about Trump there, but, you know, if the cap fits. So 10 minutes after 11. What is corrupt? What is a corrupt country? When does a country become corrupt as a consequence of corruption at the top of a country? And does anyone want to have a go at arguing that it doesn't fit to this current chapter in our island history? Yeah, you're more than welcome to do so. Phone lines are open. 0345 60 60 973 is the number you need. Steve's in Henley on Thames. Steve, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon. Good morning, James.
Hello, Steve.
First-time caller.
Welcome.
I'm a big fan. I agree with you on about 95%
but not
things.
today.
Even came to see you in Henley, but not today. You're right.
That was good. I'm glad, and we'll get onto that in a minute. I just want to say that literary festival in Henley is one of my favourites. It's absolutely lovely, isn't it? And that old town hall is gorgeous. Gorgeous town hall.
Absolutely cracking. I totally agree that Boris and many of his acolytes are a disgrace. Yeah, the prorogation, whipping his MPs last week. But I think I'd like to challenge the assertion or the statement that is the country corrupt. I think for that to be the case, it has to be endemic, widespread and absolutely ingrained. So, for example, one criminal MP, of which there have been many over the years, doesn't make the whole of Parliament criminal, even if there's a few of them. And you look at Lord Evans this morning, you know, he's the Commissioner on Public Standards, and he was asked directly, and he said, we do not have a corrupt state and public life. And there's a danger of it becoming that way,
yes,
I agree.
That's the direction of traffic, but not the...
Exactly.
You don't think we've arrived at the destination yet?
Exactly. We're certainly not living it up, having it beautiful, but I don't think we're there yet.
So you're talking about the head might be rotten, but it hasn't reached the limbs yet. It hasn't reached the fins yet, perhaps.
Elements of the head. I mean,
well, hang on, because you glossed over some of the examples. I think we're all in danger of not recognising how big they are. Rees-Mogg misled the Queen. And remember, these are the people that have Union Jack bedspreads and have pictures of Her Majesty on their bathroom walls. So this performative patriotism is pathetic. That's rather an agreeable alliteration. But these are the people that pretend that their Union Jack bedspreads and their portraits of the Queen somehow speak of a great loyalty to the country or a probity. He went to Balmoral. It's possible he was too stupid to realise what he was doing, but if he realised what he was doing, he deliberately and consciously misled the Queen, and then they unlawfully prorogued Parliament. That's not just a little local difficulty. And then, so just take two. So that one plus last week when they three-line whipped MPs to rip up the rule book on corruption after one of theirs was found to be corrupt. That's more than, it may not be endemic, but it's more than just confined. It's more than isolated.
No, I agree, and I'm not disputing that for 1 second. But I think it's all about degrees. I mean, I think Sal said it well. I mean, I've been privileged enough to live in a number of countries over the years, Malaysia, Singapore. You'd argue at other ends of the spectrum from each other in that regard. And I think Sal was right. There's elements of stuff that are terrible, and you've quoted two of them there, and there's more than that, let's be honest. But that doesn't mean the country's corrupt. I mean, I'll give you an example.
Go on.
The Committee on Standards in Public Life did a report, right? I think it was 2014, so albeit a long while back. And we came out as joint... We came out as 3% of corruption in the country, with 3%, which was joint lowest with the Netherlands.
But that was 2014.
But here's an interesting fact. Here's the point, and I think this is really relevant about the media. the perception at the same period, the perception of corruption in the country was 69% in the UK, okay?
Yeah,
and 49% in the Netherlands. So we have the same actual corruption by an independent result, but the perception was vastly higher here. Now, they've got a thing called the National Integrity Office in Holland, right?
Yes.
Which is, by all accounts...
But just pause you briefly to remind you they tried to abolish the Standards Committee last week.
I know, and I'm with you, I'm with you. It's crazy. But I still come back to the fact that the perception is...
No, I'll give you that. The perception is probably high, although I think, today's show is almost dedicated to the mapping the gulf between where we were in 2014 and where we are now. But I accept that the magnifying lens with which we view such things is probably pertinent. But, when we talk about being able to slip a few quid to a police officer in order to get your speeding ticket ripped up, we don't have that. But you do have, and we're going to be talking to Jolyon Morm in about half an hour from the Good Law Project, who, of course, has been on these PPE contracts, these COVID contracts, since well before it was fashionable. And he cites Private Eye's reporting this morning, which finds in one contract alone £84 million worth of profits from the taxpayer going not to suppliers of face masks, but to middlemen who were lucky enough to have the right political connections to essentially facilitate multi-million-pound deals. Now, most ordinary people would probably reach for the C word at this point.
No, so I'm not here to defend it or say that there's no issues, because there's clearly many of them. But as you're very adept at being precise with your language and words, and in the spirit of that thinking, if the question is this country corrupt, I think the answer is no.
Good.
There's no, I don't know that I agree
with you, because you're essentially we're just marking milestones. So let me be crass.
So let me tell you what. Let me tell you why not. Let me tell you why. Another reason is that the institutions that prevent us from being fully corrupt, i.e. independent regulation, independent scrutiny, the media, so I'm not beating the media up, I think it's got good and bad elements. Yeah, we still have the scrutiny. The fact, as you said it a few minutes ago, the fact we're having this conversation now with 1 million listeners...
means we're all right.
And also the fact that...
million and a third.
Okay. But also the fact that they did, albeit very painfully, and it should never happen, they did actually back down last week to a degree. Let's be clear.
They did.
Because the pressure was
that gives you hope and indeed evidence that things aren't as bad as they could be. Yeah, and that is why you wouldn't... Okay, no, do you know what? I probably agree with you. Up to a point. I just think we came so close last week. As I said, it was as if he had two bills, one condemning Owen Paterson, one defending him. He took a decision to go with the one defending him, read the comments under the column, and then realised he wasn't going to get away with that. So he issued the next one, which they'll vote on Monday. Thank you, Steve, and thanks for coming along to Henley as well. That was my one. I didn't have many crosses to bear during lockdown, but missing out on the literary festivals when my latest book, How Not to Be Wrong, The Art of Changing Your Mind, was published, was really tough. I love the literary festivals. It's the closest I ever get to feeling like a rock star. Don't laugh. It is the closest I'll ever get to feeling like a rock star. And just to clarify, that's 1.33 million weekly listeners, which is the number of people that tune into the programme at least once every week. So we've got no way of knowing how many of them are here for the whole 15 hours. Well, actually, we do have ways of knowing. But those numbers are even more impressive. And, hey, no one likes to show off. 21 minutes after 11 is the time, and we should probably be grateful. Was it Steve in Henley? I think it was. I think I want him to be right, that the idea that this is a corrupt country. If you're just joining us, I should probably bring you up to speed with what the Prime Minister said yesterday. I'll do that in a minute. It's an astonishing position in which to find ourselves. I don't think there's any other point in living memory, is there, where the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom would feel compelled to refute accusations of corruption on the world stage. Could you imagine Theresa May feeling that she should... Well, actually, do you know what? I should probably mention the old corruption business, shouldn't I? I just don't buy it. Tony Blair, I just don't buy it. David Cameron. David Cameron, bless his little cashmere socks. He was supposed to be going after lobbyists. I don't know whether you remember this. Before he fell down the Brexit well, he was adamant that the next scandal after expenses would be lobbyists, and he would be the man to lance that particular boil. And here we are, living in a world where Ian Duncan Smith can get paid £25,000 by a hand sanitizer company which mysteriously benefits from hand sanitizer-related recommendations made by a government body that Ian Duncan Smith chairs. That's strange times. So what's the difference then between a corrupt between a lot of corruption in a government and a corrupt country, what would be for you the tipping point? 0345 6060 973. Because I like the old fish rots from a head down analogy, but I like even more Steve's idea, and other callers as well, suggesting, yeah, we've got a whole heap of problems, but endemic nationwide corruption ain't one of them. So where do you think the tipping point is? If you've lived in a country that's kind of fallen like this, what was the moment? Like, there aren't moments, are there? That's why the boiling a frog analogy is so powerful. So what is the question I'm really asking? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know if you are living in a corrupt country? That's quite a good question. I don't know if you can answer it. There's only one way to find out. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Ben's in Alicante in Spain. Ben, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Ben.
First-time caller.
Welcome.
So somewhat nervous.
No, it's only me. It's only me.
Yeah, I don't think the UK is as yet corrupt in the sense that I lived in Italy and
Yeah.
I saw what endemic corruption was, in the sense that you couldn't buy so much as a box of matches without paying some kind of backhander to
Right.
some really quite dreadful people.
Right.
But I do think that what happens in countries like Italy, and I want to go back to that marvellous phrase, network of obligations,
Yes, it is good,
is
isn't
that
it?
what happens is that once people lose faith in a government, you could speak to us, but I had many Italian friends that would not pay their taxes, simply because I said, what's the point in paying taxes when we're giving it to these people?
Right.
So their network of obligations became their mates and their family.
Right.
And that became something that became... The reason Italy's so nepotistic is precisely because they have no faith whatsoever in government. Now, the EU, their membership of the EU... I'm not going to use the B word, but
No,
their
you
membership
can
of the
if you
EU
want. Yes.
has improved corruption in Italy. But it's certainly, it's certainly
Because it
much more corrupt.
imposes a broader network of obligations, actually, to stay with that
Absolutely,
phrase, doesn't it?
absolutely.
Yes, which is perhaps
Absolutely.
why some supporters of it in this country hate it so much.
Well,
Some supporters
I
of
tend to
Brexit
think
in
so,
this
yeah.
country hate the European Union so much.
Yes, exactly. I think that's completely true. So I don't think we're there yet. But what really scares me is that once you are there,
Yeah.
and I've seen this, I saw this in Italy. I spent some time in Northern Ireland as well, where people had no faith in the government, so they began to rely on paramilitaries to do
Yes.
the work of government,
Yes.
police work, all kinds of things. Once you're there,
Oh gosh,
it's
I'd never
very
thought of
hard
it.
to pull back from
I'd
it.
never thought of it like that. And of course, early fears in Northern Ireland at the moment that we are heading back in that direction. Another bus
Yeah, which would
torched
be an absolute tragedy.
earlier this week. So that I never understood the role of paramilitaries in the sense of being almost a replacement
another
for
form of government.
formal government, aren't they? You're absolutely right. Of course they are. Another form of law and order as well. That's
Yes.
as you said.
Yes.
So what I think we've established it probably isn't a tipping point, but I mean paramilitaries would be a fairly reliable. Of a failed state, almost a reliable indicator
a
of
failed state.
a failed
And I
state.
think you could look at it in the same way. And also the other thing that takes root in very corrupt countries, because one no longer has faith in the media, one no longer has faith in government, one no longer has faith in the police force. Bizarre conspiracy theories take off
hold.
very, very easily.
Yeah.
Because it becomes absolutely anything becomes plausible under those circumstances.
Yeah,
Anything becomes plausible.
and I don't know, it's the bane of my life trying to work out whether they do it consciously or unconsciously, but the people who cheer for these sort of governments often end up moving from quite authoritarian positions to trying to attack the institutions, trying to attack the police, for example, or trying to attack lawyers or trying to attack judges, because it's the only way they can sustain support for the government that is undermining the institutions. They've got a choice. Either they call time on the government that they've previously supported, or they join in the attacks upon institutions like the police and the judiciary, which we're seeing in this
and then
country.
it
So
becomes-
we are on the path, aren't we?
We are on the path, and I think, and once you're on the path, if you get to the point where, when I used to pay rent in Italy, because it was rent controlled, Italy, you pay it through the post office. So you pay your rent into the post office, so the government can check that you're paying the correct rent.
Yeah.
And you go to the post office and you pay it. Then a week later, a load of lads turn up at your house and you pay the proper rent, the real rent, in cash to them. Now, these kind of things, which sound really horrendous, they exist because people regard the government as being a joke, and therefore they think, well, what's the point in giving them any my hard-earned money when all they're going to do is just give it to their mates?
So it becomes... the strange thing about endemic corruption is that once the top becomes so corrupt, people begin to behave like the top, not to emulate them, but to actually avoid them.
That's an absolutely brilliant analysis. And, you know, with a combination of you and Steve, the caller before, I think we're actually quite a distance away from what you're describing. And I think...
I do hope we are.
Yeah, well, we all have to hope we are. But I think that this is perhaps the difference between consultancy roles that everybody sensible and honest finds ridiculously euphemistic and actual brown envelopes.
Yes.
So,
yes, indeed.
And that's why they can have it on a register of members' interests. There's a long way between a register of members' interests that is pretty dodgy, pretty obviously dodgy, but at least in public, and private massive payments to politicians in the hope of influencing government policy, which is what proper corruption looks like. That, Ben, is a brilliant contribution. I can't believe it was your debut. Where have you been all my life?
Thanks very much, James. We'll have a lovely day, yeah?
And you. We'll talk again. I hope we will, anyway. It's coming up to 11:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We'll catch up with Jolyon Morm, I think, after the latest headlines and come back to your calls. My apologies to Richard in Belfast, who is expecting to be up next and probably will be, but it will be a little later now. Richard, as I may as well hit one news bulletin on time in the course of a whole programme. You know, cheers up. Cheers up the troops. And then, of course, Mystery Hour coming up at 12 o'clock today. It's Thursday. This week has kind of flown by, and this will be the first Mystery Hour where I will be giving away a copy of my new board game, which I can't believe people still think is some sort of running joke on the programme. It's real. Keith exists, although he's not working today. Keith exists, and the board game not only exists, but it's available, and it's real, and lots of people have got it. In fact, I've had a complaint already today. This... Getting in early with a Mystery Hour question, James. Can I have a refund on your board game, please? What? Because I've bought one for my wife for Christmas, but she has just given me one for my birthday. Yes, you could give it to someone else for Christmas, I think. No income tax, no VAT, no money back. No guarantee. It's coming up. It is a huge story that you just heard in the news bulletins about the NHS and ambulance waiting times, warnings from health leaders that the patient safety is being put at an unacceptably high risk. The phrase breaking point has appeared, with severe staff shortages leaving hospitals, GP surgeries and A&E units struggling to cope with soaring demand. I can tell you that Sheila Fogarty will be turning her attention to that story and, of course, the attendant looming impact of Sajid Javid's determination to exclude unvaccinated staff from the NHS. That kicks in today in care homes. We took the view, rightly or wrongly, that we'll wait until tomorrow to assess the impact of that. It may be that you could have called me now, but it's Thursday, so we've got Mystery Hour, and this question of corruption continues to engross me, and it would seem you. So, I don't think we've managed to raise Jolyon from the good. It's our fault. So we'll do that tomorrow, I suspect, if time and tide allow. But Gary from Leicester says, Keith's not in today, James, because he's not real. We are going to have the voice of Keith on the programme at some point, just to prove it. He's on Twitter. You can find him on Twitter. 25 to 12. A quick recap of the Prime Minister of these islands. Well, I mean, just pause for a minute, even if you still love him. You think he's ace. Good old Boris doing his best. He's great. Then why, how, what has happened? How have we ended up in a place where he felt, and also he sounds as if he isn't in full control of his brief, doesn't he? But this is just absolutely unprecedented, I think. The only people that have to confirm that their country is not corrupt are people who are leading countries where there is a very widespread suspicion that they might be corrupt. It'd be like me standing up and announcing that I am... I don't know, I'm not a brilliant footballer. You know, it's not something I'm ever going to have to say because no one's ever going to accuse me of being a brilliant footballer. For the record, I will not be playing for England in the next World Cup. I just want to get that out there. I'm withdrawing myself from... So, do you see what I mean? So it'd be like me saying, I am not corrupt. You just go, why is he saying that? No one thinks he is. Boris Johnson thinks that he has to address the question of whether or not the entire United Kingdom is, as a consequence perhaps of his premiership, corrupt.
Since we're in an international context and speaking before international colleagues, I want to say one thing which I hope is not taken in any chauvinistic spirit. but I genuinely believe that the UK is not remotely a corrupt country, nor do I believe that our institutions are corrupt. And I think it's very, very important to say that. We have a very, very tough system of parliamentary democracy and scrutiny, and not least by the media.
Not least by the media, although there are members of Boris Johnson's cabinet who aren't that fond of scrutiny by the media. Richard's in Belfast. Northern Ireland, of course, mentioned in the last call, or certainly in Ben's call from Alicante. Richard, what would you like to say?
Well, thanks for taking the call.
You're very welcome.
I hope this comes across the way I'm thinking.
Yeah.
The leader sets the standard for those he has influence over.
Yeah.
So if he has a very high ethical and moral standard, so will they adopt a similar attitude to it. If he's morally and ethically bankrupt, those that he has direct influence over will also behave in the same way. But
well,
I don't.
Are you sure? I mean, if I don't. I mean, some of us would. I mean, you may fall out of favour. You may prioritise self-advancement over what your conscience is telling you, or you may feel that you're going to have to compromise your most sort of stringent standards in order to stay in the tent and try to. A lot of people argued this about Trump's White House, didn't they? They would say, I didn't compromise, I didn't follow Trump's lead, but I served under him because I felt I might be able to minimise some of the negative impact of his presidency. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do indeed,
yeah.
yes.
I think that's probably...
As regards the country,
yeah,
the way his government is operating and the standards to which he has decided they will operate, the medical profession hasn't suddenly become corrupt.
No.
The legal profession hasn't suddenly become corrupt.
No.
He can only have his standards, he only has influence over those who he directly influences.
Okay. Again, I mean, I don't know why you picked those two examples, because the medical profession is coming under increasing attack from his allies in both politics and the media, particularly this weird obsession with face-to-face appointments for GPs, and the legal profession has come under attack from the top down. The Enemies of the People front page that was published by the man that he now wants to put in charge of Ofcom, and then the attack upon lawyers, activist lawyers, which the Home Secretary was warned to stop making because police feared it was actually inciting threats towards legal firms, but she carried on. So that's a really good example, because the people around him might be following his lead, and eventually that is going to have to entail attacks upon the institutions that are not following his lead, I think.
That takes quite a long time, I would have thought.
Well, I
don't think a consultant going into the operating theatre will act in a different way
ever
because of what Johnson's doing.
No, nor do I. Nor do I, but a judge might. I mean, certainly a BBC executive will. Already, yes. I would argue, maybe even a BBC journalist.
Yeah.
Not mentioning
But I think
names.
when you were talking about Trump, it was very powerful to me when he was being attacked by the media at one of these conferences. And his answer was, I'm president, you're not.
Yeah.
In other words, it's worked.
Yes.
It's worked for me.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Saying Boris Johnson's career should have ended with the 350 million, but it started the most successful period of his career. It got him to the top.
And the thing we don't hear much anymore, I don't know if this was in play in Northern Ireland, actually, Richard, because there's so many different variables in place. But the thing we don't really hear much of anymore is, I know it's dodgy. You got this a lot with Trump, but I haven't heard it recently with Johnson or Brexit. I know it's wrong, I know it's dodgy, I know, but I love it because it upsets people like you. That ship seems to have sailed. I don't know, maybe I'm just on a different sea, but I don't hear that much anymore. I know it's corrupt, but I love it because it upsets people like you.
No, because it works.
Yeah?
It works for me.
Yeah?
It's got me to be the Prime Minister.
But the cheerleaders, the cap-doffers, the forelock-toggers in the crowd, why are they happy about it? Why do they love to hear, yeah, I'm president, you're just journalists? Why do they love that? Is it vicarious projection? They sort of feel part of his cult, and therefore his wins, his victories are their wins, their victories? I think that's it, actually.
If they want their own individual power, they have to adhere to what he wants, or they remove themselves and say, I'm not going to be corrupt to get what I want. But he's done it. Yeah. And he also then cannot have any discipline over his party members,
as we're seeing this week.
They'll say, well, hold on, what about you?
Yes, yeah, well, you say discipline being an interesting word, because he can still present a united front to the world, but what he can't do is sack any of them when they get into trouble, including Matt Hancock, who, of course, took the independent decision to resign after testing the lie of the land, but would have enjoyed, just as Dominic Cummings did and just as Priti Patel does, would have enjoyed the support of the Prime Minister for, I think, the reasons that Richard suggests. Well, the minute he says, hang on a minute, you've breached our standards, the whole world would turn around and go, eh? What standards? Here's your CV, mate. Where do you want to start? 11:42 is the time. David's in Milton Keynes. David, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I'm a first-time caller, so apologies if my language doesn't come across as it should. But
I'm sure it will.
In essence, I wanted to make a point, because I'm from Venezuela, South America. And I've been living in this country for 20 years now, and I love this country. I'm very proud of what I've done here. But I think it's important to reflect on what I lived before I left my country. When Hugo Chavez, which I'm sure you've heard of,
yes,
and Nicolás Maduro basically leading the country, took over and converted what it was a very prosperous and forward-thinking nation in South America into one of the worst, most corrupt places in the world, if not the most, unfortunately. And I love my country and I'm proud of it, but I cannot stand by what's happening at the moment and what's happened over the last 20 years.
Yes.
So I think my point is the steps that are happening now, that I can see happening in this government, indicates to me that the Prime Minister and his circle are, they're doing things under the law in brackets, but the steps that they're taking to, for example, try to defend Ulster Patterson last week, the way they tried to do it, it was very authoritarian, very much like, I don't know what you guys think or want to do, but I'm going to do this to make sure that my mates here in the circle are safe. And the way Chavez did it back 20 years ago, 25 years ago, was exactly the same way. I'm going to change the legislation. I'm going to make sure that all my mates are covered, and I'm going to ensure that I have a close circle that I can rely on and I can continue to work with in order to push my agenda, which is to stay in power, which is...
And that is it. That's the agenda, really, just to stay in power. There's nothing else. I mean, it's hard to imagine what else there could be. What would people point at? Because anything that was on the list of priorities has either been abandoned or completely reversed. I mean, the only agenda is to stay in power and perhaps, therefore, to, continue enjoying the fruits of power, whatever they may be, whether they're status and that sense of importance, or whether they are more material rewards, like getting your flat tarted up by a mysterious donor, I mean, so we've heard from Pakistan and now Venezuela, countries that are, I know you won't like to hear this, David, but you've made the point yourself, bywords, really, for institutional and endemic corruption, and they're both contributions saying that seems to be the direction of traffic here. But we're not there yet, not by a long chalk, I think you'd agree. I hope you'd agree.
Oh, no, absolutely. I do agree. And just to put another two examples for you, Chavez managed to change the period of presidency at the time from 5 years to 6 years, and from 2 terms to unlimited terms. And then that's how he remained in power for the following years after that. He also... managed to gain a lot of support from the police forces and the army forces in a way that he increased salaries and benefits, because he knew that those two forces will be key for him to continue to be...
They'd prop him up.
Exactly.
And I mean, there's got a logic to it. The bit I never get, the bit I haven't got for 5 years, is the deferential element of it. The people whose lives are being made worse, but who think that these men, these leaders, are their friends, whether it is Chavez and Maduro or Trump or in fact Johnson, or Rees Mogg, of all people. The idea that, he somehow cares. It's quite crazy. And then we're back to this new play that we're going to see, which is the claim that if you don't think your MP is any good, then you can vote them out. Just don't mention Zach Goldsmith. whatever you do when you're punting that line out in public as a member of this government. Davey, that was a brilliant debut. I don't know what on earth you were nervous about. In fact, everyone who says they're nervous ends up delivering the goods on this programme. The only people who have nightmares are the ones who come on thinking that they're brilliant. Present company accepted. 11:51 is the time. Here's an interesting development in the conversation we've been having about corruption. A senior anti-corruption advisor to the Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari, today issued a stinging rebuke to Boris Johnson's claim that Britain is not remotely a corrupt country, saying the UK is in fact a major enabler of looted funds from his own country. I don't know if this is precisely the sort of accusation that Boris Johnson was addressing, but I can tell you that the Professor Sadiq Isarada, who oversees the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption in Nigeria, has just said that London was actually the most notorious safe haven for looted funds in the world today. He said actions speak louder than words and talk is cheap, and he challenged Boris Johnson to deliver a long-promised law that would help stem the flow of dirty money into UK property, as highlighted by the Pandora Papers investigation last month. I think there is an argument. In fact, I don't know if it's even an argument. I think it's fair to say that David Cameron kind of had that on his to-do list, and it is one of the things that has been on ice since Boris Johnson took over. Some of that, of course, down to the fact that he has got this huge self-inflicted catastrophe of Brexit to deal with, and of course, the pandemic. But Cameron promised legislation that would unmask owners of London property bought via the type of companies that are registered in, for example, the British Virgin Islands, where, of course, Sir Geoffrey Cox spent so much time and earned so much money last year dealing with advising the government on issues of corruption. It's a bit of a theme on the programme this morning. Thank goodness Mystery Hour is up next. We could all do with a bit of light relief, I think. Mystery Hour starting at 12, all being well. Lawrence is in South Shields. Lawrence, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James.
Hello, mate.
I come from a Yemeni background. My father's Yemeni, my mother's from here, British. But I spent 27 years in the Yemen from 83 to 2010.
Okay.
And I can see absolute comparisons now, what we're seeing in the UK. Now, for 27 years,
really,
when I lived in Yemen,
yeah,
I would talk about the UK, what a brilliant place, because I was brought up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where it's a great place to be, where the law for all, and you're taken care of, and there's no corruption.
Well, listen, you're putting me in a slightly uncomfortable position where I'm going to say, look, this isn't the sort of place where if you get pulled over by the police and you slip a few dollars into your driving licence, they'll ignore the fact that you were doing 210 miles an hour. This isn't the sort of country where I will not get my collar felt by the police if my dad is powerful enough. I mean, we're not like that here.
Not yet.
Well, yeah, but that's why I'm disputing the idea that the parallels are quite as clear as you contend.
James, you have government over there, from the president all the way down. Everybody in government is either family or they're blood-related or they're friends of friends.
Yeah.
Now, when you're talking about the policeman putting over and paying a few quid for a backhander, that does happen over there, without a shadow of a doubt.
Sure.
But these are the guys that are not making money. These are the guys that are poor. You know, they probably make about $70 a month.
Okay.
But it's the guys
and it is contagious. So if it's happened, so I mean, it's not illegal, but it does seem incredible that the government's anti-corruption czar, the Conservative MP who has that title, is married to Dido Harding, who was in charge of Test and Trace, and many contracts have large question marks hanging over them and involve large payouts to people who were politically connected. And, of course, some of the politicians involved in these negotiations have, perhaps coincidentally, deleted their WhatsApp messages, even though they were involved in these negotiations with politically connected people. I don't know whether you could pick up the phone, Lawrence, at any point in the last 18 months and think, well, I know exactly who to speak to about getting a piece of this pie.
If I was in Yemen, yes, definitely.
There you go. And in this country, there's a long list of people who could do it in this country as well?
Absolutely, because I think the chap that called, I think from Rome, that mentioned about the post office payments, etc., for the housing, where the guy said, okay, why should I give my money to the government where they're going to use on their cronies. It's exactly the same thing in Yemen. People have said, you know what? If it's corruption from the top, I'm going to start from the bottom as well. I've seen it, James. I've seen.
Well, I think we're a long way from that, but it is clearly the direction of. No, I really do. I really do, because we are, our institutions are populated by decent people, and they might be trying to get their own cronies in charge. They might be trying to shoehorn people onto the board at the BBC or in as the head of Ofcom or whatever it might be. But there are still more than enough people, particularly in the judiciary, I think, who are just not going to have, if they have these intentions, then the people. And also, Parliament might wake up at some point. There seem to be noises coming out now. They have to come from his own benches with the majority of 80.
The funny thing is, James, I've got people calling from Yemen saying, you guys all right over there?
Oh, that's not. So we've got we've had Venezuela, Pakistan, Yemen. Go on.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Yeah. And I said to them, you know what? It's on the path. You know what it is? These dictators of the third world, actually, their lips and their mouths are watering right now because they want to be like us, where they can do something so corrupt, so blatantly in front of you, and then they can twist it so that people believe what they're doing is correct, was absolutely not.
It got passed in Parliament. How can there be anything wrong with it? It got a majority of MPs to vote for it. I think you'll find that's a definition of legitimate and permissible, even if it's not legitimate and permissible. It's a sort of form of democratic or democratised corruption or corrupted democracy, which brings us back to Brexit, which was, of course, won by weaponising misinformation and nonsense on an unprecedented and industrial scale. Lawrence, I love your accent, but if there was one word that I ever wanted someone with a Geordie accent to say, it would actually be Yemen. It's this dream of mine that's now come true, so I just wanted to thank you for that. I think it's the word that is best designed for the Geordie accent.
Well, South Shields is the part of the origin where it comes from. Yemenis, 1879, I think the first one stepped foot.
I didn't know that. Do you know where you live and learn? And so thank you for that. And the point you draw, the parallels you draw are chilling. Although I hope there's no sort of Pollyanna-ish tendencies kicking in with me when I say we are a long way. But there would have been conversations in all of these countries that are now bywords for institutional corruption at some point, which involve people saying, well, things aren't that bad yet. With time, we can turn this round. For the record, I categorically believe that we could. And almost to prove the point, Ruben in Redbridge, I'm not going to have time to take your call, but Ruben, what country do you originally hail from?
I hail from Zimbabwe.
And there it is. We've got the full set. I can only apologise for not having more time left over to hear more of your contribution, but we will no doubt be returning to this issue again, and we'll give you a VIP pass to get to the front of the switchboard next time, Ruben, because it is Thursday. It is very nearly 12 o'clock, and it is therefore time for Mystery Hour, your weekly opportunity to achieve the sort of satisfaction not ordinarily available anywhere else on your radio dial. And I can promise you this, it will make you at least smile.